It's my pleasure to welcome here Attila Melegh. He is a researcher at Demographic Research Institute in Budapest and also lectures at Corvinus University in Budapest. And he is known as an author, as the author of the book on the West-East Slope, Globalization, Nationalism, Racism and Discourses on Central and Eastern Europe, which was published by CU Press in 2006. And it fits nicely, I think it's a very nice final speech in this conference, because it connects some topics and concepts of post-colonial theory, which is dealing, as you know, with East-West and South-North divide, to Central European and broader Eastern European problematic. So I hope you will enjoy the speech. Then we have something like, I think, 1 hour for the speech, and then 30 minutes for the discussion. I was also told that it will be recorded and then put, I think including the discussion, right? Put on the website of the Institute of International Relations. Okay, Attila, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very kind invitation, and dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to be here and to talk about this book. I was approached rather late, nonetheless. When I got the invitation, I decided that I cannot say the same things which I published. So I sat down. I mean, I had a little bit of a time after Christmas to sit down, and then I started working on how to revisit this idea of the East-West slope, and then to speak about the new developments with regard to this. Because I think there's no point in maintaining things which have changed and then look at the deep roots of the changes. But before I start, I was not completely aware of in what community we are going to discuss the East-West slope, but I assume that I need to explain it before we go into, before killing it, right? So you need to introduce something before you kill it, right? And then the East-West slope is actually absolutely not a new idea. Not only because it existed for at least 300 years, but already because quite a number of people wrote about those things. So I would like to just mention a couple of historians and thinkers who worked a lot on this. The first person who comes into my mind is Larry Wolff. Inventing Eastern Europe was a very important book published in 1994. And that was one piece, because he said that the whole concept of Eastern Europe was invented as a slope idea. What is a slope? The slope is the following, that from the west toward the east, but basically toward the southeast, there is a descending scale of merit. Less and less civilization can be observed in case we start from the west. And then he argued, Larry Wolff very nicely argued and documented this, that this idea came into existence during the Enlightenment, and this was actually how Eastern Europe was invented. And he was also the person who said Eastern Europe is some kind of a middling, semi-civilized, semi-barbarian region. Of course, when I read Larry Wolff, I knew that something was already written. The other person who was very important, another historian, a Bulgarian historian called Maria Todorova. And he doesn't agree with Larry Wolff in a lot of points. But he wrote a very important book, Imagining the Balkans, I think that's the title. It was published in '96, so rather quickly after that. I would say not by mistake, because that was the heyday of the East-West slope. So Maria, who is also a lovely woman, you should meet her, She wrote a very important piece on the discourses on the Balkans. Of course, she was not alone in this. This was a critical review, but it was very important. So that's another intellectual inspiration for this. Maria Todorova actually argued that the Balkans is a special type of othering within Europe. That was her argument. So there was no slope idea. Then there were two authors, Bakic, Haydn. They wrote a very important piece in '95, once again, not by mistake, which was called Nesting Orientalism. Now this was a very important piece on Yugoslavia. Orientalism, of course, is the something which we live on. All those people who think post-colonial theory has something to say. So Edward Said's book on Orientalism, which was a phenomenal book published in 1978, he wrote a lot about this othering technique, but Bakic and Haydn put on top of that was the following, that they introduced this idea of a slope. So there's not only just the West is orientalizing the East or the Middle East, but actually there can be a scale like this. So they were saying that, and actually there's a lot of empirical evidence of that Slovenians are saying that, look, we are civilized, we are hardworking, look at these barbarian Croatians and Serbians. And then when you go to Croatia, like in Croatia they say, wow, we Croatians, we have always been Catholic, we have been always close to the West, well, these barbarian Serbians. And that game, this kind of a slope game, nesting Orientalism, Orientalism in Orientalism, right, was a very important thing. The only thing which hopefully I did was very simple. I took these people very seriously. That is to say, I started thinking about what kind of perspectives can be deciphered, can be analyzed in case we look at the slope in a systematic manner. So not only the post-colonial thinking is basically about how the West handled the inferior, the really other colonized other. The post-colonial thinkers are trying to rewrite the whole thing. What about the middling position? Is it really just one perspective or several perspectives? And then I started playing with this, of course, not without real-life examples. And then I started figuring out what techniques you can have in terms of political identity when you imagine yourselves somewhere in between the slope. Of course, what is that? That's Eastern Europe, because this idea of Eastern Europe was not only invented in the West, but actually it was taken over by East Europeans. So this is always this is why it was hegemonic. So this is what I was working on, and this is why I wrote this book on the East-West slope. This is why the title was that. Now, the slope, I argued in the book, actually which was very much based on the 1990s and early 2000s, was that this was a hegemonic discourse. Today what I'm trying to say, that I think this hegemony is crumbling, which means that this discourse is going to be with us, but this discourse is not going to be able to achieve a hegemony in the sense how Antonio Gramsci put it. You know, hegemony means that basically it's just very difficult to challenge it, because this is such a type of a knowledge which has its own power in itself, has a hegemonic power. So, the East-West slope is under reconstruction. I don't know the end of this story. The only thing I see is that this slope is not working anymore toward most of the Asian societies, and I will have empirical evidence for that as well. Probably Eastern Europe is one of the few places where still this slope is somewhat with us. But once again, in the end of my paper, I will argue that it is also disappearing. There are changes in this respect. So even Eastern Europe is not happy to accept this idea that we are inferior toward the West, but superior toward the further East. And then this idea is changing as well. Why I'm saying this is that in a classical sociological sense, when we analyze discursive patterns, at the same time, without assuming any direct relationship, you have to look at global political economy as well. Because the key point about the East-West slope, it was not just a mistake in thinking, no. That was a kind of a total ideology of a period which was characterized by dramatically unequal development. And now what I'm seeing is that this unequal development, only in terms of regional imbalances, is actually decreasing. So this is going to have a dramatic impact because this has been a key point in maintaining such a hierarchical imaginary like the East-West slope. So that's the argument. And let's see whether we come to a real conclusion with regard to this. The first question we have to ask is, why did we have a slope for almost 300 years? Right? It's a very important question. So once again, before we kill something, let's analyze it. Right? I'm not going to kill anything, don't worry. So I'm just playing with this. Of course, the most important thing was, first of all, colonial capitalism. Generally, when we teach economic history, we always just talk about capitalism. But this is wrong in a lot of ways because we have to talk about colonial capitalism. There is recent economic history, most importantly I refer to the book of Pomerantz, which is saying that, let's say, China was just as capitalist in the 18th century as Europe. The only difference, there were several differences, of course, but the big difference was, or one big difference was, colonization. And then the next thing which is important, and we cannot imagine capitalism without colonialism. Right? The two things appeared at the same time, and actually it was the same process. The key point what my distinguished colleague József Böröc he argues in a book in 2009, that basically Western Europe always had a big problem, namely that they were small. That is to say, in case we look at the global economy up till actually the 18th century, Europe was a minor player. I mean, none of the political entities of Europe could actually even question such entities like India or China in terms of global influence. We should not forget that till the mid-18th century, China and India represented more than 50% of the total GDP of the world. So this puts the whole thing into new light, into new perspective. So basically the key problem of the West is how to control when you are small. And then the technique they used is an old one actually. You could find this among Greek colonialists as well. Namely that you set up a network. And then the small European powers set up a network in order to control the big ones, the huge territories and the big economies. It's like my, at that time, favorite book of mine when I was a kid, Gulliver, in Lilliput, right? And Gulliver is lying, right, on the land, and then these small guys are coming and doing this, I mean, controlling, actually roping him down, right? Now this is what Europe did. Basically they figured out some kind of a technique, and that was very much about navy, it was very much about a lot of things, to get onto these huge chunks of the global economy, and then to change it for their own benefit. But of course, there's no such thing as political economy in itself. you need to have cognitive techniques for this. And the cognitive techniques were also there. I've worked a lot on population discourses in my life, just to amuse myself. And then, there's one key person in thinking about population. This guy is called Thomas Malthus. Everybody knows him. He was a very interesting guy. Not many people know that he was an educator of colonizers for 25 years in a college in Britain. And then, in case we look at his theory, then I think it's a classic technique how the slope can be done. I always knew that he had a slope technique. But I never understood really why he was doing this. Some people might say we can joke about him that basically he argued that the most civilized thing is to have a late marriage and no sex before marriage. Right? And some people were joking, of course, in Britain, what else can you dream about? But that's, a minor joke, and I think it's not very serious. But I think Malthus, even in Europe, was against all his colleagues in Europe. Because in case we look at the German thinkers like Sussmilch, or we look at people like Montesquieu, they always argued, a country is better if it is more populous. So why don't we have more people? And Malthus was the guy who was saying, no, 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 no. That's not the right way. The right way is to control population development. And in case you don't control population development, then you get into trouble. So Malthus was actually, this is the technique. Out of an inferiority complex, you create a superiority complex, right? So you reverse the whole thing. So what Malthus was saying, basically, all these two populous countries, including China and India, they are reminding the past of England, and then England is over that. Whether he was right or not, it's another story. I don't want to go into this. Historical demographers will tell you that Malthus was wrong about his own country, but that's not an issue for us today. The issue is the technique, right? So he was saying that England was the focal point of civilization because of, having a lot of negative check on population, late marriage and no sex before marriage. Plus, very importantly, that the positive checks like war, famine could be avoided. This is how England became. And also Malthus was the guy who was there in some ways the founding father of birth control. Of course, he was a moral philosopher. He was not for birth control in itself, but he was for birth control techniques. Actually, he despised that. But later, the followers of Malthus used this idea. And then this is how we got to the colonial population policy of Britain. And then, of course, also the global population policy from the 1930s. So that's the story. Out of inferiority, superiority. The slope, therefore, is a technique to control the world from the point of view of inferiority. Right? Okay, that's the point, what I'm making. It's very provocative, but I really would like to have good discussions about this. Eastern Europe. How was Eastern Europe put into this? The key thing was Eastern Europe was, first of all, by this, let me not go into this debate. I know I'm in Prague. And then everyone said, hey, come on, this is Central Europe, my dear friend. I use Eastern Europe as, and in that sense, it's actually Bohemia doesn't belong to this in some ways. I'm talking about East European agrarian societies, like my own country, right, Hungary, or Poland, or Romania. Bohemia has always been more, industrious, more industry and more urban than the others. But Eastern Europe nonetheless received an enormous amount of intervention on behalf of the West. And then the key technique in the colonial period for these countries was the following. First of all, they were fighting for some kind of an independence from this. Plus, very importantly, they tried to maneuver themselves into a position like the West, but not really like the West. This is what I called in my book petty imperialism. That is to say, in case you cannot, be a colonizer, at least try to control some parts of your neighbors, right? So the Hungarians had this complexity or this problem with regard to the Balkans, also with regard to the emerging country of Romania, and that's the way how it went. Now the key point was that, and this is I think the other claim, this slope was the way how nationalism could be formulated in this region. And nationalism, once again, it was not just a local development. It was a global positioning game. And then local nationalism was basically trying to get into these positions. Let me give you an example, and then with this you can understand why I'm talking about slope. Sorry for the text, but it is important. This is a text after the First World War, where there was this infamous peace treaty in Versailles. For Hungarians, Trianon, right? I don't care. So Versailles peace treaty, where Hungary had to sign, the cutting up of the Hungarian kingdom, which lasted only for a couple of decades. Don't tell it to Hungarian nationalists. And then there was a guy called Count Oponyi. He was the head of the Hungarian delegation. And look at his argument, how he wanted to defend the political integrity of the Hungarian kingdom. Let me just read it quickly. Among the Hungarians, the ratio of the literate is close 80%. Among the Germans in Hungary, 82%. Among the Romanians, 33%. Among the Serbians, 59%. And some decimal points, almost 60%. In case we look at the higher social classes, and we take into account those that finished secondary schools and took the exam called baccalaureate, my French is not that good, his French was far better, in France, then we can observe that among those having completed such studies or educational levels equivalent to the concerned final exam, the proportion of Hungarians reaches 84%, although their overall proportion in the population is 54%. Meanwhile, among those completing such studies, the ratio of Romanians is 4%, as opposed to the proportion of 16% in the total population. While in the case of the Serbians, this is 1% related to their 2.5 overall population ratio. I repeat, my remarks are not hostile toward anybody. Of course not. The only reason for this situation that due to the unfortunate event in their histories, our neighbors joined the family of civilized nations later than us. But the fact, and let's listen now very carefully, but the fact is undeniable. In my view, the assignment of national hegemony to a low level of cultural development is not without consequences from the point of view of the greater cultural interest of humanity. That's the slope. In the name of humanity, we are more civilized, so we are entitled to control these other nations, because they are less educated. Objectively, right? Percent shows the slope, right? That's the way how it works. Well, Count Oponyi was not that successful, but you see, I'd leave it to historians why he was not successful. But actually, he was using the dominant discourse. That's the point what I'm trying to make. Look at this. The next quote is how he tried to raise the awareness of these civilized nations, of the French, the Italians, and the British. And then I quote again, it's not on the slide, I just quote. Please allow me to state that beyond the victorious France, England, and Italy, I can see the contours of that other France, which has always been in the forefront of generous efforts and the representative of great ideas, of that England, which has given birth to political liberties, and of that Italy, which was the cradle of Renaissance, arts, and intellectual progress. And if I acknowledge the rights of the victor without pouting, then I feel different with that other France, England and Italy. And now the key sentence, I bow with gratefulness and I am happy to accept them as our masters and teachers. So basically he was trying to assure his position and that of the country, saying that, oh, we love you civilized nations. It's not very nice what we are trying to do to us. Please give us the same role and then it's okay. Now, in case we look at this, I call this petty imperialism, and when I coined this term, after that I read a book which not many people teach nowadays, but I found it very useful, Lenin's book on imperialism. And there are two very important pages in that book, and he called this sub-imperialism. And it's a very good empirical typology what he's giving. He said there were two types of sub-imperialisms. One, when small nations with the help of big ones wants to be colonizer. Perfect. Second was countries which are seemingly independent are not independent, but basically they are dependent. These were the two things what he was referring to. I think that was a brilliant 3-paragraph by all standards. Okay. Now, the colonial capitalist system lasted till, well, not everybody agrees on this, but lasted till the Second World War. Right? That's the latest. By the end of the Second World War, the West completely lost control, at least Western Europe, lost control over the colonial systems. And then there were 2 decades, very brutal one, a very brutal 2 decades of decolonizing, that is to say, when the colonial system collapsed. Just pay attention to the thing what happened in Kenya, right? There was this recent scandal in Britain, concentration camp set up. Who initiated that? Well, Churchill started the whole thing in 1952. That was the infamous Mau Mau rebellion. That's what I'm just referring to. So brutal decolonization. And then basically the West killed itself because it was fighting over this political and economic hegemony. And in the end they kicked out each other, right, in this respect. And then the winner was the United States, which was, first of all, very importantly, not a friend of European colonization. Never forget that. They never supported that. But at the same time, Western Europe ended up in a dramatic situation. Okay, the other thing, that by the end of the Second World War, not only the colonial system collapsed, which was already a huge blow to the previous system, but a new system emerged as a bloc. The Soviet Union was there, but state socialism emerged as a bloc. And then the state socialist bloc actually controlled 1/3 of the total surface of the Earth, and around 1/6 of the population, which is really big enough in global resources. And then this challenged the whole system. But the slope somehow survived even this period, and this is very interesting. It survived, but with some very important changes. The first thing was that the anti-communist Western discourses were of course using the previous techniques of the slope. But at the same time, they had to acknowledge that a viable competitor came on to the surface. And this viable competitor was capable of 2 things which they never expected from the colonized. First, rapid industrial development, plus relevant and rather efficient military technology. And then the slope within the West, but even outside the West, was changed into less of a civilizational character, but some kind of a competing modern systems which are different in quantifiable terms. I was very much surprised when I started looking at the discourses used by the CIA during the 1960s in Eastern Europe. And there was a real sense of competition. And then there was this real fight over the quantity of the difference, right? That was the key thing, that we have to measure this. Within Eastern Europe, the same thing happened. It was the modernization vision of the East Europeans, was that Are we going to catch up sooner or later? Infant mortality is almost as good as in the West, but not yet, right? And how to do it. So there was a competition. It was still hierarchical. It was still a slope. And I have the very important claim that East Europeans could never actually challenge the slope during their life because they accepted the Eurocentric vision of the previous system. And I think with this, actually, to be honest, from their own point of view, they made a huge mistake, because that was the way how they could not handle the second word, was not able to handle the third word. Now, some new research is done on this. I can only say that this research is coming up like this. This analyzing the historical analysis between relationship between the second and the third word in terms of cultural and, you know, from the point of view of post-colonial criticism. This is a brand new research. Just a couple of people started that. And it's very interesting because there was a lot of ambiguity. In some ways, East European socialists used the old colonial language in some ways, but in some ways they did not. So from the point of view of post-colonial thinking, this is a brand new area, and the only thing I can say is that let's work on this as quickly as possible, because this is something very important to understand. Okay, let's go quickly. I know I'm claiming too much that, let's say, in 45 minutes I'm able to handle 300 years of history. I'm trying to give some ideas, right? The next point is the collapse of state socialism in the period with regard to the East-West slope. I already observed in my book that in the early 1980s there was a dramatic shift in discourses. Basically, this idea of competition between modern systems collapsed, and then the idea of Europe came up as a guiding principle, and this was a return back to the old civilizational idea of the pre-Second World War. And then there was this kind of a colonial discourse. I know, I mean, this is kind of a very critical thing to say, that the colonial discourse existed. But I think actually this slope, by colonial discourse I mean this slope discourse, was actually institutionalized into such things as the enlargement of the European Union. Joseph Burrett analyzed it very nicely. I use this as a very good example. The only thing I put there in my own language is the following, that in case you look at the so-called Copenhagen criteria, that's basically the slope. Because it says that, first of all, there are certain criteria according to which rather undefined criteria, viable market economy, right? What is viable? That there are certain criteria in which Europe is absolutely okay, everybody who is trying to join is not okay, and then they say, it's not a question that once you can join us, the question is the time, right? How quickly you catch up in this process, and that the whole Copenhagen criteria was basically this liberal humanitarian utopia, which in another way is some kind of a hierarchical colonial discourse. But there were already some problems around this, and this is what I'm trying to say, and it was not clear in that book, so this is something new I'm trying to put there. While this was really the heyday of the East-West slope, the global economy started changing very rapidly. This is what we call the new international division of labor, and then the new international division of labor actually created real global markets, which never existed before. In the colonial capitalist system, there was no such thing as a global market, because basically some of the key players could control the whole system in their own ways, and there was no way that somebody could make a use of comparative advantages. The big change is that when global capital was reconfigured in the 1980s, it moved into first to Latin America and then to Asia. And then this was a dramatic shift in the sense that from that point on, comparative advantages started counting. They became very, very important. Now, the other thing which was very important, and this leads us to this new period again, that the East-West slope during the collapse of the state socialism was efficient locally. But this local efficiency was also only a short-term victory. What do I mean by this? The local elites, it was one of the key points why they wanted to actually finish state socialism. Because they were saying that, look, this is not a real economy, this is not really a Western economy, let's make it. But they did this with an eye on having some local hegemony, and politically. And then, of course, the European Union was a very handy power in coming to help in this kind of a local debate. And then these local powers could really get into power. But the problem was the following, namely that this led to a rather dramatic restructuring of the economies. And then these problems could not be really solved very well. So, coming to the concluding parts, concluding arguments. Why am I saying that the East-West slope is under dramatic stress? That is to say that this construct, which has been so powerful in creating knowledge, global knowledge for 300 years, why am I saying that this is crumbling? First one is hierarchical systems like the East-West slope, and this was an argument in my book already. This is why it was subtitled Nationalism and Racism, is that such hierarchical systems in themselves lead to more nationalism and more racism. That is to say, nationalism is a good answer for such hierarchical challenges, because what do nationalists basically say? They say that we have to revitalize our nation because we are not having the proper position in this hierarchical game. This is the kind of a global positioning they are doing, which means that there is, in such hierarchical systems, there is a tendency toward more nationalism. I showed you the historical examples. Now we can go to similar ones today. Let me just... No. Sorry. Okay, let's, before we go into this, allow me another argument, right? Because that's also very important. Today, we can see that the slope technique is there, and they try to use it. The only thing I'm saying that this is not very efficient. Very importantly, nowadays we can read that there are a lot of troubles, cultural, civilizational troubles with East European immigrants, right? So, the first scandal came into existence in Italy, right? You remember in 2007, there was a huge scandal around Romanian immigrants in Italy. There was somebody killed, and then this is what the mayor of Rome said at that time. He said, if they are in Europe, right, then they have to be obey its laws. It cannot be that they just open gates and they send thousands to another European country. A massive number of union members and non-members have arrived in massive numbers, not immigrants fighting for survival, but criminals. I do not want to generalize on a country. Even the convict was identified by a Romanian woman. Right? But I cannot say that this is an isolated problem. And then Veltroni notes the following. When 75% of the arrested people come from one country, And the scenario looks very similar. All are characterized by violence, theft, rape, and murder. That was the image of the Romanian immigrant, right? Most importantly, it was a nesting Orientalism, sloping the slope, because there was a hidden talk about Roma. That is to say, it was not just Romanians, but Romanian Roma, right? Then the Romanians reacted in the same way. Well, look, these Roma are destroying our European fame, so they should be sent away. So then the Romanian foreign minister came up with this fantastic idea, let's send them to Egypt, all of them, right? That was the reaction of the Romanian foreign minister. He had to apologize in 2 weeks' time, but it shows that the slope was there. But the point what I'm trying to make is the following, that this did not work. In case I look at the figures, you know, there was a dramatic anti-immigrant discourse in Italy. But actually, immigration to Italy went up dramatically afterwards. Let me give you the figures, right? In 2007, 342,000 resident Romanian citizens lived in Italy. In 2008, it almost doubled, 625,000. And then even after that, it went up by little by little. The only thing I'm saying is that there's a dramatic demand for these immigrants because of the change of the political economy, which means that they cannot live without them. So the East-West discourse, the slope doesn't work. That's the point. The same thing can be said about France, and the same message I have for Mr. Cameron, who is playing the same game right now. Even, this is when he started, in 2012 he started already his campaign with regard to Britain now wanted good immigration, not mass migration. Nonetheless, I don't want to go into this problem of numbers. The only thing I would like to say is that I'm pretty sure that immigration to Britain is not going to slow down because of the change of the political economy. Basically, the key point is the following. European wages are just too high, right? West European wages are just too high to maintain competitiveness, so they need immigrants, badly need immigrants who work for less. This is the only way how they can maintain their global position. So the only thing I'm saying that the East-West discourse doesn't work. Let me give you another example why the East-West slope is crumbling. In 2012, there was a march in Hungary. This march was a pro-government march. But when I looked at this, me, the author of the East-West slope book, I almost fainted. I look at this, oh my God, what the hell is going on here, right? Because it says, nem leszünk gyarmat, meaning it's already there, it's not proper English, but it's not a problem. We will not be a colony, right? This is what they were sending to as a message to Brussels, that we will not be a colony. You know how many people went to that march? Well, the lowest estimate is around 200,000 or 300,000. Right. So, the point I'm trying to make is the following, that the slope, with its hierarchical techniques, it doesn't work as a hegemonic discourse, because already people start reversing the argument, and that they are talking about, you know, this is a kind of a nationalist demonstration, which is claiming we are not going to be a colony, that we are fighting against this European-led hierarchy. Do not misunderstand me. Most of the demonstrators would be happy to play the same hierarchical game with Romanians, right? But at least they don't want to be. They don't want to be. Now, further points with regard to the questions, to the collapse of the East-West slope. In 2009 and in 2010, I was happy to participate in 2 surveys. The surveys were about the hierarchical understanding of development. And then it was one survey was done in Bulgaria and one in Hungary. I show you the results. I think I have this now. Do I have this? Very nice. Yeah? Probably yes. No? Okay, I just want, yes, it's here. Oh, sorry. Okay, I go out and I show it to you, right? Just a second. So, the key point is the following, that this is the GDP per capita of the countries, right? Okay? This purple line is how respondents evaluated their own development, right? And the development of various countries. You can see 30 countries were evaluated in Bulgaria in 2009. And then the yellow one is not that interesting for us. The yellow one is the Human Development Index, right? Now, when this survey was done, then my American colleague Alan Thornton called me, "Hey Attila, you are lucky, here is your slope." And I said, okay, yes, there is the slope. Namely, in case you look at the correlation between the purple and the GDP per capita, it's very strong, right? The Pearson correlation should be around 0.85 or something like that, or even more, right? I think it's even on the graph. No, it's not there. You know, very strong correlation, basically, between the two things. And then we found the similar things in Hungary as well. Namely, that, and in case you look at the slope, this is northwestern Europe and then further down toward the southeast. Right? That's the way. But there are some exceptions. Don't pay attention to the Netherlands, because probably they made a mistake in the survey and this is why it's there. The key point is the following, that Turkey and Russia was much overvaluated, right? Overvaluated. Can you see that? Clear? Okay. Meaning that the real GDP per capita of these countries is far less than perceived by Bulgarian respondents, right? The same thing happened with regards to the Hungarian respondents. The Hungarian respondents, once again, is almost exact in rating their own countries. The only thing, China and Russia, right? Of course, the two slopes are not the same because, as Maria Todorova put it very nicely, there's this Balkanist self-hatred is there, right? Bulgarians firmly believe that they live on the level of Central African Republic, right? They are not living on that level, that's for sure, but they firmly, this is Balkanism. Hungarians don't have such problems. Hungarians don't believe that they live on the level of Central African Republic. But in both countries, respondents show that the bigness of the country, how big it is, it matters. Plus, they can see that even some of their old enemies, right? I mean, Turkey for Bulgaria. I mean, everything I expected, but not the thing that they overvaluated Turkey's development, right? I thought that they would use this Orientalist discourse, right, on Turkey, but they are not. Which means that the East-West slope is actually crumbling in a lot of ways. Okay? Sorry, and then the very last sentence, the very last point. So the East-West slope was a dominant discourse till the early 2000s. After that, it is still in use, right? I'm a historical sociologist. I firmly believe that cultural patterns are really very persistent. And I'm not saying that the East-West slope is gone. The East-West slope is still an engine in history. It can still cause a lot of troubles. The problem is that it is crumbling because the dramatic change in the political economy. And the fear I have is the following, that in case this geopolitical decline of Europe comes with an idea of superiority, it might give ideas to achieve, to revitalize, to regain previous positions. And I think the very last thing I really would like to see is to enter once again into major conflicts because of some firm beliefs of hierarchical systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we open discussion. I think we have 20 minutes or so for discussion.
clarification problem with how is the East-West slope discourse not working with regard to immigrants in Italy? You meant that basically they are changing the population is put together, or what exactly did you mean by that?
The only thing I was trying to say is that this anti-immigrant discourse is using the East-West slope by all means, right? And then this is a political discourse which, as a political talk, is accepted, right? The public likes that. The only thing I'm saying that it is unable to achieve real institutional changes. Right? So whatever Veltroni, whatever Italian politicians, Sarkozy or Cameron thinks, they can't go ahead. The European Union itself is one way of destroying the East-West slope, because the European Union comes and says, hey, come on, you can't have discriminatory rules. But this is also with regard to the whole political economy of the European Union. They are not doing this just out of goodwill. They are also doing this because they know that they badly need these migrants, otherwise the labor force is not going to be enough. So the only thing I'm saying is that this is a complex situation in which they use it, but it is not powerful enough to get institutionalized.
Okay, if...
No question. You mentioned, thank you very much for your presentation, it's very thought-provoking.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about, when you mentioned about the inferiority complex playing a role in...
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look at him. Sorry.
Playing a role in when you mentioned about Thomas Malthus,
yes,
that it was actually inferiority complex that drove him to reverse the idea that population is strength, because as we see, it just used to be as a factor of production, population was good. Now he said that no, smaller population is better, because then you could distribute the wealth of the nation to very few, so higher welfare. Of course, that Malthusian theory for the Philippines is rejected, because we believe that there is a demographic dividend. But that's not really my point. But you also mentioned about that slope. There's the west and east slope, wherein the west have this idea that they are on top, and then the slope goes down, and that is the east. Or there is a divide between someone who thinks that our culture is civilized, and there are those who have less cultural development. So the idea in the past was that, okay, we give them education, we promote certain values, which may work. And the truth is, many of the developing countries have benefited from Western concepts, particularly in the Philippines, the faith, for instance, Christianity, which is quite strong in the Philippines. But I'd like to look at how you thought of inferiority complex, viewed in your example of Thomas Malthus, and the east-west slope, wherein I view that the Western notion, when you look at this argument, is a feeling that we are superior to the rest, which, as you said, is crumbling, because if this is going to be continued in the debate on migration, then there will be no structural improvements in trying to allow protection of migrants in the particular country where migrants are coming in to the host country. I don't know if I make sense, but I just needed some clarification.
of course you make sense, and some of the points are very important. Let me explain Malthus a little bit. Malthus was a real change in thinking. Not because he was such a genius, but in terms of demographic thinking, this was really a big break point. Malthus had a father. What a surprise. Robert Malthus, he was a political economist. And of course, Malthus was also a political economist in a lot of ways, right? And then what changed his mind with regard to population was something he learned from physiocrats. Because the physiocrats introduced this problem of diminishing returns in land, in agriculture. Now, diminishing return is a very interesting point, because this is when basically you are saying that in case the population is growing, then it's going to lead to diminishing returns. That gave the impetus for Malthus to change ideas. But at the same time, we should not forget that how is that possible that almost everybody was saying the opposite? Nonetheless, Malthusian population policy could achieve such a dramatic rise. And I think partially it was the colonial system itself. So the colonial administration always used Malthus. For instance, in India there was a famine, actually two famines after 1857. And in both famines the British were arguing, let's not give relief to the very poor and to the starving, because then we are reproducing. Because Malthus was not only globally controlling, but locally controlling as well. So let's not give them relief, right? Because then we are going to reproduce this shit. And we should not do this. So one thing which made this in this way. And the other thing is that surely the last thing England wanted to see was, that population is a real power, right? And then population size matters, right? So the only thing I'm saying is that these things coming together led to this kind of a slope technique, which actually was also done by Malthus himself. Everybody reads the Principles of Population, published in 1798, but that's not the thing. The big thing is what he wrote after his marriage, which was the global part of the whole story. This is all the time the slope, right? So we have the fireland in Latin America, which is the worst, and then you get to Australia, point number 2 in the slope. Point number 3 in the slope, Central America. From Central America you go to New Zealand. From New Zealand you go to China. From China you go to India. From India you go to... And that's the way how the slope goes. I can show you the whole map of it. I have a slide at home, which I use, where you can actually follow this kind of a slope technique. The only thing I'm saying is that this was a fantastic technique which could be used to counterbalance such real facts, which could hide that very small populations could control the whole world without, feeling inferior, right? So it was a superiority complex to counterbalance this inferior position, right? That was the argument I was trying to... I know it's very provocative, but I really would like to ask you to come into this, start rethinking European intellectual history from this point of view. You might get into very interesting conclusions. The other thing with regard to the migrants, that question I did not catch completely, was that migrants are invited but they are not taken care of, right? That's what you wanted to say?
No, I think I got your point when you said
that the slope being used as an argument by some politicians or leaders may not really work, because if that continues, then there are no demonstrable structural changes in trying to accommodate the need for more migrants.
Right.
As a country of 100 million, where 10 million of Filipinos are working overseas, we are a country of out-migration. And we are of the view that migration is beneficial for both the host and also the sending country. And it could be managed well through a particular set of systems. Even diplomacy can play a role. Even embassies and consulates can protect their citizens, so that there will be a relief of pressure from host countries in trying to ensure that the migrant workers are protected, because they can be protected also by their own state through institutions of diplomacy. diplomacy, like embassies and consulates. One example is Mexico, where they have 51 consulates all over the United States alone, because a number of migrants, because of the borders, work in vulnerable situations in the United States. So that was just my point. But can I also speak about Malthus? Because the Philippines is under tremendous pressure to limit our population. And this started 30 years ago when the US aid promoted population control. Absolutely. In fact, my mother was a social worker, and she was invited to go to Hawaii to be trained. But because of her own freedom of conscience, she felt that she cannot promote contraceptives unless it's natural contraceptives. And so that's just my own thinking of population as a child. But now I realize in international relations that it's also being used as a tool of giving and granting aid. For instance, the US aid would give aid, but it's tied with selling of artificial contraceptives. And some of these contraceptives are actually abortifacients, meaning they're not just going to control birth, but actually induce abortions, which is illegal in our constitution. But this argument of limiting population is still very strong in terms of how US, of course I'm not judging, it's just a matter of fact, that they're using the aid in ensuring that population is controlled in certain countries, including the Philippines, and I also know of Africa. And this comes into play also in trying to promote women's rights and also some other alternative rights to ensure that it's also connected with the right of choice, rather than just looking also as maybe, perhaps, we don't know, we have no monopoly of knowledge, maybe that the meeting of the egg cell and the sperm cell through conception is already life, and that we do not know, but it's better to side in the side of caution. So for Filipinos, we are very careful in promoting this abortifacients, for example.
I think let's just make, because the points you have been making are very important, can be used for us. So global population policy has been rather, it's a massive industry, even today. It has been a massive industry. Basically, trying to control population growth outside the West for two reasons. One, true belief that it's better to have low fertility. But at the same time, all the time there is this talk about the ratio of Westerners and the Europeans in the global population. I have a bad news for them. It's going to be small, and it's getting smaller and smaller in a lot of ways, even if that, in my view, that doesn't matter. The only thing I'm saying that there has been a population policy like this, and then the slope was used as a technique for this. In reality, fertility is declining everywhere, but not because of the Westerners explaining contraception and Malthus to these people, but because of the education of women. So demographers know it very well. There's only one real factor behind dramatic population fertility decline, is the education of women. As soon as women are educated and properly educated, high fertility is over. The best example I have for this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran cannot be blamed for too much liberal humanitarian ideas, right? In my view. Nonetheless, they educate women. They have very good universities, and secondary school system as well, and they educate them. And what happens? Fertility in 2 decades went down from a total fertility rate of 6 to 1.8. Right? This is what I can tell to Malthus. Right? In some ways, that probably not his ideas are the most important things. But the slope is there, so I agree. And US aid. So it's one of the things. US aid was based on this, right? On this idea.
Well, I have a question regarding something that's common for many Central European countries, as that's the Roma minority and Roma communities, which, I mean, sometimes as a part of the racist discourse is, well, they come from India and the words they should go back, for instance, you know. But otherwise, I'm not really sure that this kind of like internal othering of the internal minorities within the countries are subject to the East-West slope. But perhaps with the stronger impacts on the Roma issue being more prominent in the Hungarian politics, could you see any elements that make also the othering of the Roma, which are actually in the territory, as a part of the East-West slope?
For sure, the Roma have the following unfortunate situation. That already in a region which sees itself as being inferiorized, they are seen as being inferior. So it's a kind of a double inferiority they get immediately. And when I wrote my book, there was this famous, and actually it sounds bad even today, there was this famous case of Zamoy. And then it was the following. There was a big scandal in a Hungarian settlement called Zamoy, and there was an attack. Actually, there was a murder. First, the Roma were forced to live they were pushed out on their own houses, and they had to live somewhere else. It was a complicated story. Nonetheless, the Roma families got together, and then with 2 buses, they left for Strasbourg. They went to ask for asylum in France. And then when they asked for asylum in France, then surprise, surprise, an article appeared in a very important British journal called the Jane's Intelligence Digest. And the Jane's Intelligence Digest was saying the following: Roma minority is used by some kind of a conspiracy of, I'm quoting, French communists, ex-KGB, Jews from Israel. And when I looked at this, oh my God. First of all, it reminded me of Himmler, right? Who are the main enemies? Communists, Russians, and the Jews. Jews, communists, Russians, and the gypsy, right? So this is how we can put it. Okay. And then, you know what happened? The Hungarian government, which was the first Orban government at that time, went public and said, look, here we have documents showing that there is a conspiracy against East European nations like us trying to access the European Union. And it was, a strange thing. And I said, it's not okay. The liberal opposition of the Hungarian government at that time also went there, and they said, hey, come on. They started writing a letter to the French government. French government has nothing to say in refugee things in France. If somebody knows the French legal system, that's not the case. They wrote, dear Lionel Jospin, you always support the East European immigrants, like the Hungarians in 1956. Do the same again, right? Now I say, the story for me was not okay. And while I was writing my book, actually, I bumped into an article by accident. And it was the following, 2 things. Actually, one was related to Prague. You remember that the British migration authorities sent some people to the airport of Prague, right? Okay. And then the thing was that they were checking who was getting on the plane. And then some people made a scandal out of this because they were saying the same, and then the supposedly Roma person was not allowed on the plane and the other one was allowed. And then started, things started getting together in my head, namely that, okay, probably the Jane's Intelligence Digest, I studied in England, I studied at Oxford, so I know British attitude. The last thing they do is that the Hungarian government comes and as the liberals claim, they go there and they say, hey, we want to publish an article here. No, the British would not do that. And then I understood, and then there was another article about the Munich scandal, which was related to this, that actually the British intelligence service started making an investigation about the Roma immigration. And then the big thing about these refugees, would-be refugees in Strasbourg, was the following, that they wanted to avoid a precedent on the basis of which Roma could claim refugee status. Because they knew, in case they lose in this, then lawyers in Britain could go and claim, look, they got asylum in France, they should get asylum in Britain as well. And then look at the press debate now about East European immigrants. It's Romania and Bulgaria, but basically the Roma behind the whole thing. There was a big hysteria in the British press about Roma not looking at really Roma, and so on. So such, stereotypes, such attitudes, such hatred is guiding such things. This is what I'm saying, that the slope is something which is evoking such things like racist hysteria. Right? And then this is why it's related to my book, actually, what is happening now. So I'm not surprised that the British are trying to do this. In the case of the Zamoy case, I know at that time they already had 30 Roma families in Britain, 30. Not the travelers, 30 immigrant Roma families. And that was enough that they started an intelligence service operation. And actually it was acknowledged by Jack Straw. So then later I got the interview of Jack Straw, in which he was saying that, yes, we had such an investigation.
Okay, there was Nadia after, but I will interject my own question before Nadia, because it's connected directly to what you said. Because I think exactly on the question of Roma, and this is my hypothesis, I'm eager to know what you think about that. On the issue of Roma, we could argue that some aspects of the slope are really crumbling, especially those aspects which were to be seen on ideological level between West and Central Europe during the process of accession. Because at that time, and I remember those cases, by liberal elite, which was promoting the accession to European Europe, it was taken, there was still, on this issue, there was this feeling of lagging behind liberal tolerance, which is in Western Europe. We have this Romophobia here. We didn't get there yet. We have to fight it so that we can join, okay?
Exactly.
And
exactly.
From Italy, and from this Italian case and Sarkozy's case, suddenly you feel that they have caught up us, in a way, right? Because at that time it seemed like we are still too Eastern, because we hate Roma, we are xenophobic, we are not really tolerant, we are not ready yet to join European Union, right? The last 3-4 years, I don't have this feeling anymore, because you have the same kind of Romophobia in France or Italy. So what's the difference then? But it didn't happen as we, some of us liberals, I belong to them, imagined, because we imagined we will catch up them, that they have caught up us now. So we have this president in this country who said, before he became president, that Islam is anti-civilization. Okay? Okay, he's still ruder than Sarkozy and Merkel and Cameron, because they wouldn't say this openly, right? But they have, you could say that there is a mainstreaming of Islamophobia in Western Europe, especially in France and Germany, I think. So they wouldn't say such horrible things like Muslims to the Nazis, which our president did, right? They wouldn't say that, but they might think it, you know, and they are using coded language. So this is the only difference which maintains that they are more polite in a way. They wouldn't say such racist talk, right? They wouldn't. But basically, we are even. I don't feel the feeling of, we have somehow to catch up with the West, because I think, the West caught up with us.
Maybe just one quick remark to this. In some ways I agree, in some ways I don't agree. Yes, you're right, in terms of political communication they are far better. They don't tell what they think, right? The problem I have is the following, that more and more I study global history, the less and less I believe that they are catching up to us. They are maintaining a thing which they have been doing for quite a time, right? So in that sense, look, I refer to this issue in Kenya. Let me just rise it for a second, right? Just in order to get on into the topic, right? So we are talking about the 1950s, right? For the sake of 16,000, I'm quoting historians, for the sake of 16,000 white settlers, they push out 1.2 million Kikuyu peasants from the Western Highlands in Kenya. And then, of course, they're trying to secure their positions, right? Because they could already see the decolonization going on, so they wanted to have that, right? And then these peasants are kicked out. They have two possibilities. One is to go to a reservoir, right? To the reservatum, right? And the other one is that they go back as farm servants to their own land, right? As farm servants. Then a couple of people start a rebellion, right? The Mau Mau rebellion. It's called Mau Mau because actually the British did not understand. They were saying it's a liberation front, but the British said Mau Mau, right? And then, I don't want to go into the story. We know it's that more than 1,000 people were executed by the British, more than 1,000, right? Which is a very huge number. And then the total number of dead is somewhere estimated between 30 and 300,000, right? This is the estimates, we don't know. Why? The situation was the following. 2 years ago, 5 people from Kenya went to London and said, look, we were tortured. One was castrated, actually. We were tortured by the British. And then we would like to get some compensation for that thing. Then they went to the Supreme Court, right? And they said, we want a case against the British government. Then what was the immediate answer of the British government? Oh my God. The immediate answer of the British government was the following. We have nothing to do with this because we handed over power in 1962. It's a little bit of a logic, right? So it's about the 1950s when they were in charge, and then they have nothing to do with this. And they said there were no documents, and now all of a sudden it turned out, and they digged out the documents, right? As soon as they digged out the documents, there were thousands of documents, and I'm quoting once again, and it was also in the British press, but I'm also quoting some of the documents. One is that don't kick them in the soft parts. This is an order given to the British Army. Don't kick them in the soft parts, but you can put soil into their mouths and you can put your boots onto their neck, right? They were setting up concentration camps. Constant propaganda was going against the Mau Mau terrorist rebellion in these concentration camps. More than 60,000 people were in such concentration camps, right? And then even the British governor wrote to his own government saying that we should stop this because what we are doing is what the Nazis did and what Stalin did in the Soviet Union, right? So this is when I'm saying that probably the important thing is to open our eyes and then to see that this has been going on in quite a number of cases. And I think that the language is somewhat different, right? And there are a lot of things still to be spoken about. I'm not saying that the British were the worst colonizers. The Belgians were far worse. I'm not saying such things. And I also don't want to go into this debate of civilization. The only thing I would say, yes, ideas spread. I mean, by the null hypothesis I have, right, in statistics, is always that people read each other, right, and they learn about each other. And then the last thing I think about is that I have to teach the others, right, because ideas are floating, goods are floating, everything is floating. So in that sense, I always have the opposite assumption. So the only correction I would say, East European liberals tend to forget about the global history of colonialism. That's all I'm saying. And I have a lot of evidence for that.
Okay, Nadia, please.
I had two comments to what you said previously. One feeds into what you're saying now. When you mentioned that Malthus advised against giving people food during a famine in India in the 1850s, I think it's also important to remember that these famines were actually caused by the British, by high taxation and pushing the Indian peasants into not growing their own staple crops, but rather crops for import to Britain. So it was caused by them as well. So that's just a small comment to add to what you were saying, really. And the second comment is a bit of a qualification of your, when you mentioned that education is an important tool in emancipating women and enabling them to have less children. I agree, but on the other hand, I think we have to remember also that education in global south countries can be a tool of oppression and of westernization as well, especially when it is education. For example, half of the tribal children in India are educated often far away from their home in a completely different language. And this is not only the tribal people in India, it's Indonesia, and quite often this education is very Western-centered, and the children then lose connection with their own cultures. So I think, like when they say the Millennium Goals of education, you have to be very careful about what this education really means. So that was just another comment I wanted to make.
I agree with both comments. The first one is important. The British always had this idea, even in the Irish famine, they cited Malthus. So they took this seriously, that's for sure. The second point is a very important point. Look, when we are saying that this hierarchical thinking has been one of the dominant forces of history, then I am not really surprised that the world actually become like that. So in some way, some of the, there's always a debate in post-colonial literature about this. Some people are saying that, we should delink, we should turn against. Some others, like Chakrabarti and some other people, are saying, hey, come on, the Enlightenment has become really universal. So why don't we? The only thing is that they deny us of the same ideas and the same rights as imagined in the Enlightenment. So as a historian, right, and as a sociologist, I think that most of the thing has already been done. In some ways we can say that the world has been westernized in a lot of ways. Now the thing is, the real challenge is not only just to write back to this, but actually to start figuring out such visions which allow more and more people to live in a more egalitarian way. In case you ask me back what perspective I have for this, I'm saying past is past, right? I have a PhD in history, but I always say past is past. The good thing about history is that it's got done. It's over, right? Should not come back again, right? The only thing we should learn some lessons, and otherwise let's forget it quickly, right? Otherwise we get into trouble.
Yeah, but I was speaking about the present when I was speaking about education.
Yes, that's true. It's going to be a fight, but even in that sense, I think things are changing. So then let's say, look at the global media market. Just one example. I mean, for the last 10 years, we have seen a dramatic change. I mean, come on. 10 years ago, basically, we could watch as global media BBC and the CNN. No? Today, honestly, this is, I think, a big thing. Especially with regard to migrants. Al Jazeera, whatever we think about Al Jazeera, right? Whatever we think about, whatever politics they are doing as well. Global media is always doing politics. Nonetheless, just the sheer fact that such a global media channel exists and operates and raises issues like, you see, the history of the black in France, right? I've never seen such a good thing on France Fanon and Amy Césaire than on Al Jazeera, right? Also, migrants. I mean, Al Jazeera has a very good eye on migration. As a migration expert, I like it, in a lot of it. You know, CCTV, Russia Today, whatever we think about that, right? Things are changing. I mean, now the CNN is in the corner in a lot of ways. Right? And then 10 years ago, they could always just say, you know, Western democracy, and so on and so on. Now, Russia Today, of course, they have their own language, they have their own style. They say, oh, American democracy, don't make me laugh. Basically, that's Russia Today, right? But I'm not saying that I accept this. The only thing I'm saying that it has changed dramatically. And I think even in education, I think things can change rather dramatically. If that is an answer to you, I'm very much on behalf of this, but I think a lot has been changed already.
I think on that hopeful note, we can finish